I want you to imagine something for a second. Um, Imagine you are walking completely unarmed into a raging war zone. The air is thick with smoke, there's gunfire echoing down the street, and you are stepping right into the middle of it.
Yeah, and you have, like, no protection at all, no Kevlar, nothing.
Exactly. You aren't carrying a weapon. You are armed with literally nothing but a notepad, a pen, and just this hope that you can convince two furious, heavily armed sides to stop shooting at each other.
Which is, I mean, it's a terrifying reality. And it plays out almost entirely in the shadows.
Right. And today is July 7, 2026, and the world is actually relying on these invisible peacemakers more than ever before. Yet, as we're about to see, they are in more danger right now than at any time in modern history.
Oh, absolutely. The people who are attempting to hold the fabric of global security together, they're finding themselves deliberately targeted.
So today our mission is to take a deep dive into the World Mediation Report 2026. This launched this past February in Doha.
Along with a pretty thick stack of related scholarly legal frameworks.
Yeah, lots of reading for this one. But we are going to unpack a hidden crisis, which is that global peacemaking norms are collapsing. The very mediators trying to stop the violence are losing their shields.
They really are.
But before we get into the weeds, I want to make a really clear note to you listening. Our sources today deal with some incredibly raw, active, and politically charged conflicts.
Right, we're talking about Gaza, Israel, Sudan, Ukraine.
Exactly. And as your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking any political sides, and we are not endorsing any specific viewpoints. Our job is strictly and impartially to analyze the data, the trends, and the arguments presented in these 2026 reports.
That distinction is vital, I think, because the environment these mediators are walking into is defined by a complete breakdown of established rules. I mean, the 2026 report diagnoses the current global climate with a very specific phrase.
Oh, right, the normative and institutional collapse.
Yeah, normative and institutional collapse, which is basically the academic way of saying the global guardrails have completely snapped.
They haven't just snapped. They're being actively dismantled. For decades, the international community relied on these UN-led multilateral rules to undergird peace processes.
Right. There was an expectation that diplomacy had its own designated protected space.
Yeah, but what the report tracks now is this rapid shift toward militarized politics. States are just bypassing the UN entirely, favoring what the data calls transactional minilateral peacemaking.
And when the report says transactional minilateral deals, we're essentially talking about ad hoc bilateral side deals.
Yeah, it's essentially conflict management rather than conflict resolution. These deals are exclusive, they happen behind closed doors, and they usually prioritize the immediate interests of the brokers over, long-term stability.
Right, they just freeze the conflict without solving the root grievances.
Right.
And operating alongside this is a renewed great power rivalry. It's created this highly dangerous tolerance for the use of brute force.
Okay, let's unpack this, because trying to visualize this shift is crucial. It's like trying to referee a soccer match where the players have suddenly decided to ignore the governing body.
Yeah, they're just making up their own bilateral rules on the spot.
Exactly. Making up rules and bringing baseball bats to the pitch. The overarching legal framework has been bypassed, and everyone is just acting on raw leverage.
That captures the mechanics of it perfectly, honestly. The overarching governing body is just ignored in favor of raw power dynamics. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you start to see how great powers exhibit this glaring double standard.
Oh, the double standard is wild.
It really is. A major global player will publicly push for peace talks and mediation at a UN summit, while in private, their intelligence agencies are actively arming and funding one side of the conflict.
Which makes genuine dialogue-centered settlements incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
Literally mathematically impossible. The space for diplomacy is being squeezed out by the logistics of militarization.
Right. And because that overarching rule book of diplomacy is being ignored, the referees, so the mediators themselves, are now being directly targeted. They have a massive target on their backs.
Yeah, the legal scholars in our sources refer to this as a legal lacuna.
A legal lacuna, so a massive gap in international law.
Exactly. There is currently no universal treaty, no specific Geneva Convention protocol that universally protects peace mediators. They operate in this legal void.
They're relying entirely on the shifting goodwill of the people fighting the wars.
Which is terrifying. And the report categorizes the fallout from this vulnerability into 4 distinct areas, starting with the most visceral, the physical risks.
I mean, we aren't just talking about accidental crossfire here.
No, not at all. Spoilers, meaning that the factions or warlords who benefit from a prolonged war are deliberately assassinating mediators.
To blow up the peace process.
Yes. The sources point all the way back to Count Foch Bernadotte in 1948.
Wait, 1948?
Yeah, he was a UN mediator trying to negotiate a settlement during the Arab-Israeli War, and he was ambushed and assassinated by the Lehi militant group because they feared his peace plan would demand territorial concessions.
So they didn't just want to kill the man, they wanted to kill the terms he was carrying.
Exactly. And we see that same mechanism replicated decades later. The report highlights the Afghan mediator Arsala Rahmani in 2012.
Right, the former Taliban official turned peace negotiator.
Yeah. He was gunned down in traffic in Kabul, and his assassination wasn't random violence. It was a surgical strike designed to sever a vital communication channel. When you kill the conduit, the dialogue dies with them.
But the data shows this physical threat is escalating beyond just individual assassinations, right?
Unfortunately, yes. The report highlights a paradigm-shifting incident from October 2025. An Israeli airstrike hit an office in Doha, Qatar.
And Doha is supposed to be completely neutral ground in that context.
Exactly. This was a space actively being used by third-party actors to mediate between Israel and Hamas. The strike killed a Qatari security officer and wounded several others, including mediators.
Which sends a huge message. Hitting a neutral mediation office signals that a safe harbor for diplomacy basically no longer exists.
Right. If a neutral office in a mediating country isn't off limits, nowhere is.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us to the second and third vulnerabilities, legal and reputational risks. And these seem deeply intertwined.
They are. A mediator can face crippling sanctions or even prosecution without immunity.
Right. If the political winds shift, they're suddenly accused of bias by their own home country.
Yeah. But the reputational destruction is where it gets really insidious. The sources detail how spoilers launch these massive misinformation campaigns to completely ruin a mediator's impartiality.
Because impartiality is literally a mediator's only currency.
Exactly. The report uses Kofi Annan and Staffan de Mistura's efforts in Syria as prime examples. They face severe travel bans and smear campaigns.
And these campaigns are sophisticated, right? Using state-backed media or bot networks to paint them as agents of Western imperialism.
Yeah, or partisan hacks. And once a mediator is smeared by state media, the warring parties can no longer use them as a face-saving excuse to back down. The off-ramp is destroyed.
Without that trust, their leverage evaporates. And that isolation feeds directly into the fourth risk category, the psychological toll.
Which is immense.
Yeah, this part of the research really stood out to me. We expect these people to absorb the trauma of a war zone, to carry the weight of thousands of lives, but we give them zero institutional backing.
None. There is a 2024 study referenced in the report focusing on 28 experienced women mediators.
Right, and it details a staggering level of trauma, severe burnout, chronic sleep loss.
And for women specifically, the sources note the intense strain of balancing family anxieties with conflict zone deployments, plus the constant threat of sexual harassment from the armed actors they have to negotiate with.
And yet the prevailing institutional attitude has largely been to just tell these negotiators to practice self-care.
Which is absurd. You cannot deep breathe your way through witnessing atrocities and getting daily death threats.
Yeah, that's profoundly inadequate.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. I was reading through this massive list of physical, legal, and psychological vulnerabilities, and I kept coming back to diplomatic immunity.
Right, it's an established mechanism in global politics.
Exactly. If a mediator is stepping into a war zone, why can't the international community just issue a blanket diplomatic passport to anyone mediating a conflict? Give them a legal shield.
Well, official UN and state envoys do get diplomatic immunity based on their status, though importantly, that coverage evaporates the moment their mandate ends.
Okay, but what about the non-official ones?
That's the core issue. The most effective peacemakers on the ground are rarely foreign diplomats in tailored suits.
They're the grassroots organizers.
Exactly. They are local NGO workers, tribal elders, religious figures, and members of local women's networks.
Right, like the highly respected local leader in Darfur, Sudan that the report mentions.
Yeah, in 2023, she was acting as a community mediator for resource disputes, and was murdered by armed groups who oppose the settlement terms.
And local mediators like her do not get diplomatic passports.
No, they have no embassy to retreat to. They rely entirely on shifting, informal goodwill, leaving them entirely exposed.
It is a devastating reality. And reading through that grim data, it makes it obvious why the 2026 report suggests a massive pivot in global strategy. If mediating active militarized wars is this lethal, the logical answer is to stop the wars before they erupt.
Which brings us to the concept of preventive mediation, early dialogue to head off violence.
Right, and the data backing this up is incredible. The report cites Berkovich's historical analysis of 1,300 mediation cases.
Yeah, and his findings are stark. When mediators step into low-intensity disputes, they achieve a 64% success rate.
64%.
Yeah.
But the moment fatalities pass the 10,000 mark, that success rate plummets to 39%.
Because once existential stakes are on the line, the psychology changes. The sunk cost fallacy takes over.
It's like preventative medicine versus emergency surgery. Treating high blood pressure with a daily pill is obviously better than attempting a quadruple bypass while the patient is flatlining.
A perfect analogy, yeah.
But, so what does this all mean for the timing? How do you force a patient to take medicine if they don't even think they're sick yet?
What's fascinating here is a classic Cold War study. The report resurfaces to answer that exact question. The research found that intervention must be early, but it absolutely cannot be premature.
Premature. So the parties must first recognize a stalemate.
Exactly. They have to realize they cannot achieve their goals without unacceptable costs. But the mediator has to catch them right in that window of hesitation before they are fully committed to a war.
That balancing act sounds incredibly delicate.
It is. The contrast in the case studies really illustrates this. Look at Guinea in 2008.
Right, a major success story.
Yeah. After a military coup, UN and African Union envoys intervened immediately. They didn't wait. They leveraged the threat of regional economic sanctions and offered structural support.
Averted a civil war before the blood was spilled. But then you contrast that with Sudan in 2010 and 2011.
Right. Mediators poured immense effort into the peaceful secession of South Sudan, but they failed to consolidate that early success. The initial border and oil agreements lacked enforcement.
So the initial peace was basically just a pause button, and it led to a horrific relapse by 2013.
Exactly. Preventive mediation requires sustained backing. But if the data proves early prevention works better, why isn't the international community fully funding it?
Yeah, why is it still a niche effort?
The answer lies in a really thorny ethical debate about who we are willing to negotiate with. The tension between making peace and enforcing justice.
Right. Does calling for early negotiations mean ignoring immediate human rights violations?
That's the fear. Does it collude with impunity by not demanding accountability for war crimes?
I mean, taking the stance of a frustrated observer here, if a mediator is forced to stay perfectly neutral and never call out atrocities just to keep a seat at the table, aren't they basically allowing bad actors to get away with murder?
This raises an important question, and it's tearing the peace-building community apart right now. It leads to this fear of bureaucratic prevention.
Bureaucratic prevention.
Yep.
So, where governments pretend to engage in peace talks just as a smokescreen while secretly preparing for war.
Yes. The mediation process itself is weaponized as a delay tactic, which is why women's mediator networks and civil society groups argue that just making a deal with power-sharing elites isn't real peace.
Right. True prevention has to address root grievances, or it will just be a superficial settlement that inevitably shatters.
Exactly. An illusion of stability built on unresolved trauma.
Okay, so knowing all of this, the intense physical dangers, the institutional collapse, the ethical tightropes, how do the experts propose we actually fix the peacemaking system?
The 2026 World Mediation Report outlines a few core blueprints. First is adopting formal protection.
Pushing for a UN Security Council resolution, right?
Yeah, or a new Geneva additional protocol granting legal immunity and penalizing attacks on mediators.
Okay, what else?
Second, mainstreaming security and well-being. Embedding security advisors in peace teams and making trauma resilience and psychosocial support mandatory.
Treating the psychological toll as a real hazard. That's huge.
Third is sustainable funding. Shifting budgets from purely reactive crisis response to funding early warning infrastructure and UN standby teams of mediators.
And finally, monitoring. Creating a UN special rapporteur or a tracking system to log casualties and attacks on mediators.
Just like how the WHO tracks attacks on health workers, yeah.
Okay, these are great, but I have to ask a pragmatic question about global politics here. The report itself says great powers are overriding multilateralism.
Yes.
So won't those same major powers just veto these new protective treaties to protect their own proxy interests?
And that is the ultimate paradox. The authors agree with your skepticism. Their conclusion is stark strengthening the legal shields for mediators is fundamentally impossible without simultaneously rebuilding multilateral political consensus.
Wow. You can't pass a law in a system no one respects anymore.
Exactly. The legal fix requires a broader political awakening.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, but I want to bring this entire deep dive back to you, the listener. Why should you care about the nuances of mediator protection?
Because isolation is a geopolitical illusion.
Right. In a world this interconnected, global conflicts dictate everything from the cost of groceries and supply chain stability to international security. The failure to protect these invisible negotiators means more conflicts will spiral out of control.
And that directly impacts your daily life and your future.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over that builds on the report's note about states having double standards. Consider this. Look at your own country's national budget. We easily track how many billions are spent on defense and weapons, but how much is earmarked specifically for conflict prevention and mediation?
It's usually a fraction of a fraction.
Exactly. If your government spends billions preparing for war, but only pennies protecting those trying to prevent it, are they truly a sponsor of peace? Or just managing the optics of violence? Something to think about until the next deep dive.